Oftentimes, when discussing new ideas or discussing how these new ideas may be developed, we tend to think in terms of novelty, or that these new ideas can just, let's say, be developed in and of themselves without being in relation to anything else. However, such concepts of novelty can be quite misleading because new ideas do not just spawn into a vacuum. They develop in response to or develop from other ideas. They develop in relation to their context. By decontextualizing how ideas really do develop, the processes by which these ideas develop, it takes away from what makes the development of ideas so valuable. We expand upon what our forebearers thought of, what they came up with, what they developed within their times from past ideas or ideas which were already present in their times, and then they gave it their own unique creative spark. In other words, many new ideas that are developed, and I have talked about this quite extensively in the past, are simply developments from previous ideas that may have existed, or are developing upon certain ideas in ways which have not been fully realized yet. Take the ancient Greeks, who borrowed a lot from the ancient Babylonian and Egyptians. And even with the ancient Greeks, the Christians and the Muslims borrowed heavily from them. Even within these specific traditions, within them, we can trace how these developments stem from one another, from different sub-aspects of these traditions or different subgroups of these traditions, so to speak. For example, in terms of the development of Christianity, and this is not so much on the idea side of things, but this is more in a practical sense perhaps, or in a social, or in the sense of how it manifests into the real world, there is this kind of warrior spirit that isn't necessarily an inherent part of Christianity, but rather it is an import from European pagan, specifically warrior culture and ethos that existed pre-Christianity, and this is especially true within the Western context. And even the bureaucratic structure of many of the churches, in particular the Catholic Church or even the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, are very much imports from Rome, from the Roman bureaucracy, so to speak. Of course, when we speak of the Islamic faith, there are multiple influences such as the Greco-Roman, the Zoroastrian, or the Hindu. This is, of course, in relation to the development of these civilizations and how these faiths developed in terms of how they were identified with and practiced on a civilizational level. But even with many of these religious projects or spiritual projects or philosophical projects, even inherently, so to speak, they very much did develop within their context. This does not downplay that new ideas can be developed or that novel ideas can come into existence, but rather it's simply to show how these ideas develop in relation to older ideas, how they expand upon older ideas and develop within that context. For example, of course, Christianity and Islam are developing within the context of the quote-unquote Abrahamic tradition, or what I would more aptly term the Semitic tradition, which is that long line of Semitic prophethood and that institution of prophethood that is integral to the Semitic story, not only about the Semitic peoples themselves, but how they view the world, not just in these particular terms, but also in these very much universal and also transcendental terms, not just on a physical level, but also in terms of the metaphysical and spiritual. Of course, we can thus see how many of the stories within both Islam, Christianity, and even Judaism, how many of the stories about the prophets, how many of the conceptions about God, even many of the responses to external philosophies were very similar in many ways, or even if they weren't necessarily the same or very similar, there are a lot of parallels between them. Of course, we can see how Christianity, how many of the great Christian thinkers borrowed quite heavily from things like Neoplatonism, of course, like from a lot of Christian philosophy, is in many senses building upon or expanding upon a lot of Greek philosophy or a lot of previous philosophy, but in a Christian manner, in a Christian framework. And the same can be said for a lot of Islamic philosophy, where there is a lot of influence from Greek philosophy, for example. We can look at some of the very earliest groups, such as the apocryphal, somewhat apocryphal, but nevertheless perhaps did have a very real effect. It's a group such as the Jahmiyyah, by the likes of Jahm bin Safwan and earlier than him Ja'ad bin Dirham. And like I mentioned, even though these are somewhat apocryphal groups, let's say, or even though they did exist, but sometimes the historiographers or the heresiographers rather may have exaggerated how influential they were. Of course, it still remains the case that this is an example of a group that was quite heavily influenced by external philosophy, for example. Or, for example, we have the case of the Mu'tazila, which of course was one of the first, but also perhaps the most major or most significant of the what you could term ultra-rationalist or rationalist sects of Islam that adopted the Kalam theological method. Of course, on a historical basis, this led to the reaction of the Ahlul Hadith school, and this led to the synthesis then in the form of the Ash'ari and Maturidi school. Another example of this is to see the reactions, or rather the interactions between religious projects and modernity, and in particular when we look at the Islamic faith and its interactions with modernity. By and large, most segments, or at least many segments of the Muslim world, have rejected modernity in one way or another. Either they've rejected some of the implications that some of the processes of modernization bring with it, or they've outright rejected its fundamental or underlying logic. Of course, when it comes to things like fundamentalism or reactionary fundamentalists, you very quickly realize that there are some contradictions in its opposition to modernity, but simultaneously the ways in which it is quite heavily influenced by modernity. But you can also see the responses of traditionalists, reformists, and outright modernists. You can see the responses of the likes of Iqbal, of Shari'ati, of Sayyid Ahmed Khan. You can see the political movements that have arisen, or the various social reformist groups that have arose in response to many aspects of modernity, or the processes of modernization and even westernization within the Muslim world. Whether it be the various reformist movements within the Indian subcontinent, like the Deobandi movement, the Barelwi movement, the Ahlul Hadith movement, whether it be the reformist movements of Sayyid Ahmed Khan, the modernists, even in the Iranian context, whether it be the Islamic Revolution of 79 or the Islamo-Marxist movements, or many of the leftist Islamist movements of that time frame and of that period, whether it be the modernization or the attempts at modernizing Islam, whether it be the reformist attempts, the attempts to give Islam a kind of Western-styled reformation, these various attempts are different responses in response to modernity. But the point being is that these developments did not arise within a vacuum, they are responding to something. You can also see in the interaction of Salafism and traditionalism, more specifically of traditionalist Sunni Islam and of Salafi Sunni Islam. We can also see in the interaction between Islam and the West that although many will adhere to Islam on a fundamental level, they will still borrow or adopt many aspects of Western discourse, or they will appreciate and still benefit and incorporate many aspects of Western philosophy within their own frameworks. An interesting example of this is, of course, the great poet of the East, Allama Iqbal, who borrowed many aspects of Western philosophy and gave them this kind of Islamic theistic flavor to it. Most notably, his ideas of khudi, or his ideas of overcoming the self through servitude to God, is a theistic Islamic version, so to speak, of what Nietzsche understands to be the Übermensch, or the will to power. Within Western thought itself, you have things like the Renaissance, which were influenced or inspired by many of the works of the Muslims before that period of time. You have things like Christian humanism arising from the Renaissance. Of course, after the Renaissance, you had things like the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. You then had things like the Enlightenment with its emphasis on rationalism, with the likes of Hume and Kant, with the likes of Locke, with the French philosophers who inspired or created the intellectual conditions and ground for the French Revolution to occur. You had the likes of Marx and Hegel. You had the likes of the Romantic movement, which arose after the Enlightenment. You had the age and conflict of secular humanist ideologies, which marked a lot of the 20th century, including the World Wars and the Cold War. And that history creates the conditions, both intellectual and socio-political, for the future to play out. The point to make here from all of these examples I've given is that all of these developments stem from one another. They stem from something. They don't just occur within a vacuum. And hence the common ideas of novelty that we often have are quite misleading, because they ignore what makes the processes of developing these ideas truly unique in the first place. In other words, it's not about developing these ideas in a vacuum or them being completely 100% original, but rather in many cases it's simply expanding upon and developing upon original ideas, or ideas which originally already have existed. Expanding upon these previous ideas and developing them in new ways and giving them that new creative spark. It's about explaining ideas in ways which previously weren't necessarily realized, or synthesizing different ideas, or developing them in certain ways in which they weren't developed in before.